Hi, it's Nikki Lowe and welcome to the Wisdom for Working Mums podcast show. I'm your host, and for nearly 2 decades now, I've been an executive coach and leadership development consultant. And on this show, I share evidence-based insights from my coaching, leadership and psychological expertise, and inspiring interviews that help women like you to combine your work, life and motherhood in a more successful and sustainable way. Join me and my special guests as we delve into leadership and lifestyle topics for women, empowering you to thrive one conversation at a time. I'm so happy that you're here, and let's get on with today's episode. I've been looking forward to today's conversation for a while because my guest is just incredible. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Kate Hayes, and Kate is head of women's performance psychology at the Football Association, so the FA, working closely with Serena Wiegman and the Lionesses, so the European champions in 2022, World Cup finalists in 2023, and back-to-back Euro winners in 2025. And before joining the FA, she led the national psychology support at the UK Sports Institute through Rio and Tokyo Olympic and Paralympic cycles. She supported athletes across diving, including Tom Daley, professional rugby with the Harlequins, and the history-making Cambridge Women's Rowing Programme. In short, when the stakes are high, Kate is the calm in the storm and the catalyst for sustained success. And as a working mum, she'll also share how she's navigated that dynamic herself. In this conversation, she shares the elite performance strategies that create sustainable success, practical tools you can use at work and home. And Kate's book is my absolute favourite from 2025, and I genuinely think it's in my top 5 that I've ever read. I have found myself recommending it to all of my clients this year because it is jam-packed with such wisdom and expertise. She pulls back the curtains on actually what she does with elite athletes that leads to this success. And it has so much application for us as professionals. So I can't wait to share this conversation with you. I hope you love Kate as much as I do, because she's just one of these women that I think more people need to know, listen to and learn from. So I won't keep you any longer. Let's introduce Kate. Welcome, Kate. It's a real pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I've been really looking forward to this.
And me too, because we had a conversation a while ago and I've been really, really looking forward to this. And before we hit record, we had a conversation because I had to reschedule this, unfortunately. I was so gutted. So I am so glad that we are now having this conversation because, as you know, your book is been my favourite book of this year. I've been recommending it to everybody I speak to and all of my clients. So I can't wait for us to dive into this conversation because I think there's going to be so much in here for people.
Oh, thank you so much. It was, as you know, it was a bit of a passion project for me. So it's really, really nice to hear that feedback. So thank you.
So for those who don't know who you are yet, can you explain what your role is and a bit of your background?
Yeah, of course. So my name is Dr. Kate Hayes. I am a sports psychologist. So I've been working as a sports psychologist for the best part of almost 25 years, which always makes me feel so old. And I am starting to feel old now. I'll be very, very honest. But yeah, I've been doing the job for quite a long time. I started out in the world of British diving. So I worked in highboard diving for many, many years. And in between, I've worked in professional rugby, professional football, a whole range of different Olympic sports, led the psychology team at the UKSI, which is the main organisation in our country that provides sports science support to athletes and teams. And I've worked in the corporate sector as well. But essentially, I've been working as a sports psychologist for a pretty long time now.
And I remember speaking to you and kind of going, every team or sports person you've worked with has kind of just done phenomenally well. And you're like, that's just luck. And I'm like, no, it's not. There is a common denominator here. And that's what I can't wait to dive into, because for my audience, a lot of them are in corporate roles, part of or leading teams. And we all want to work in a high performing team, but it kind of seems like this secret sauce. It's like, well, what is it and how do you define it and how do you create it? And that's what I love about your book, because you literally give us the building blocks of here's what I do with the teams that I work with. And clearly your most recent success has been with the kind of Lionesses, hasn't it?
Yeah, I joined the FA back in 2022. So I was actually, I'd been speaking to Kay Cossington, who was the director of the women's program at the time. She'd reached out to me during that year. And I'd had several conversations. And the more I spoke to her about the women's program and their aspirations and what they were looking to do, just the more excited I got about that whole prospect. And I've been incredibly lucky to be able to work at the FA for this preceding 4 years as part of the head coach Serena Wiegman's team. It's a phenomenal group of players and of staff, and we've had an incredibly enjoyable ride over this last period. It's fair to say.
So, am I right in saying that your role is head of psychology for the Female Football Association? Have I got that right?
Yeah, I'm the head of women's psychology at the FA. So that's my full-time role currently. And I began that role off the back of a relatively similar role at the UKSI. So I led the psychology team, which is a team that look after all the Olympic and Paralympic sports. And I ran that team in the lead into the Rio and then the Tokyo Olympic Games.
Brilliant. So we know we've got somebody with such amazing caliber on here, and that's why I'm so excited, because I think your experience and expertise is just, that's why I love your book. It's like, oh my gosh, you're taking us behind the scenes on what like elite sports people do. So in terms of performance psychology, what does that practically mean? What might your typical week or month look like working perhaps with the Lionesses or other sports people?
It varies so much, and there's different levels to working as a psychologist in sport. So I always think about it in terms of layers of a system. So you can either be working in a kind of reactive way on the front line during competition and providing support in the moment. That's kind of probably the top of the pyramid. You could be working in a one-to-one structure where you're helping individual athletes develop their mental skills for performance. You could be working with technical tactical coaches where you're basically trying to instill psychological characteristics through technical tactical training. You could be working on relationship dynamics, whether that's player to player, player to staff, staff to staff, or you could be working systemically, which essentially is helping to facilitate an environment that's conducive to positive mental health as well as world-class sport performance. And if I'm really honest, I think sports psychologists have talked about working systemically. They've talked a good game for a period of time. And that was one of the things that I was really interested in when I took over the psychology team at the EIS or the UK Sport Institute is, but what does that actually mean? So there's so many people that talk about working organisationally, working systemically, but what does that actually look like? And it was part of the reason for the book, and it was a big part of the project that I'd ran at the UKSI, is about, well, how do we define that? What is absolutely non-negotiable? If we're trying to create teams, as you said at the start, that can perform under the highest level, but also in a way where their mental health is protected, what does that actually look like? And what's absolutely non-negotiable in order to achieve that success? And that's what I think that has been my direction of travel over the last few years. As I mentioned, I started out life as a sports psychologist working for British Diving. So that was quite often small groups of athletes that had a personal coach, and you would work very closely with those individuals and their coaches around helping them develop the mindset and the skills to be able to perform under pressure. Where when you strip everything away, essentially that's what sports psychology is about. It's about enabling people to execute their best performance, whatever performance looks like for them, under the greatest pressure. And essentially, what do we mean by pressure? It's the importance of performing well in challenging circumstances. So it's the difference between talking through your ideas of a pitch or a presentation, and then taking that into a boardroom and pitching that idea to somebody that's going to say yes or no and either finance that or not, and the implications of that. So it's about being able to perform with consequences. So I spent a lot of time working in diving, working with individuals. And then it was only when I started to then work in team sport that I obviously had the question of, okay, well how does this look? because the first team sport that I worked with after working in diving for a long time was working in professional men's rugby. And suddenly you've got 50 individuals that make up that team that are all performers in their own right. And how do you influence the performance of the team? You're probably not going to get the biggest bang for your buck by working on an individual level. So then the question came for me, well, how do you upscale good performance psychology with individuals into a team environment? And then later in my career is, how do you upskill that into an organization and into creating systemic change? And that's really where the book came from. I feel like I spent the last 25 years trying to figure that out because there wasn't anywhere to go. I was walking into a team environment and I was asking questions, but I didn't have the answers to them yet. I didn't know what that could look like.
Yeah.
And that was why it was really important to me to write the book. And I wanted to write a psychology book that didn't feel like a textbook. I wanted to write a book that felt like a storybook, that somebody could pick it up and find something in there that they could immediately apply to their world and to their context. And I hope that's what it's done. But that's definitely where the idea came. There's so many unbelievably talented people doing spectacular things in all walks of life. And so often you don't get the opportunity to learn from it. And I've had so many unbelievable opportunities. I've worked with some phenomenal coaches, some phenomenal athletes, some brilliant people. And I've benefited so much from those interactions and that learning. And I just wanted to share that. I wanted to try to distill that work into something that would make sense to anybody that picked it up.
And I genuinely think you've done that, Kate. But literally, I cannot tell you how many people I've shared your book with or given them little nuggets. So for those listening, you talk about working in kind of diving. The foreword is written by Tom Daly. So for anybody in the UK, he is a household name. He's just been on Traitors, hasn't he? So he's like a TV star now as well as like an elite sports person. And the little nuggets that both you and Tom share are just so powerful because it's brilliant storytelling, but you can kind of connect to it even if you've not got that sports background. You talked about the rugby. Was it the Harlequins that you worked with?
Yeah, it was. Yeah, Harlequins, which is a professional rugby team in London.
Which again is they're world renowned. And there was a piece in the book where you go around speaking to each of the players going, are you clear on strategy? And of course, the strategy had been drummed into them, but what you realised was actually they don't understand when they're on the pitch in that moment what the strategy is. And just that picture of you've got a picture of the pitch and how it's divided into 4 zones. Powerful.
That's the example actually from the work with the Red Roses, the women's that specific example is from the women's England team, and that's an example of aligning strategy with behaviours. So there was in my mind, when you strip it all away, psychology is pretty straightforward. In team sport, it's about the ability is absolute clarity in the game plan and then the confidence to execute that under the greatest pressure. And actually that's the same in all walk of life, whether that's in business or teaching or dentistry or anything else. It's, do you have absolute clarity in the roles and responsibilities that you need to execute, and then the confidence to be able to do that regardless of the stakes. And what we found with that team at that time was that there were some of the more senior players within the squad had absolute clarity over the strategy and the method of play, and were able to distill that in a way that made sense. But that wasn't necessarily completely shared across the group. And so myself and the head coach at the time, we kind of just went out to establish what's our current reality, what is the understanding. And Simon Middleton, who was a coach at the time, he did an unbelievable piece of work then, which was to convey that information in a way in which that made sense to everybody. And I think that's a real skill and a real talent. Sometimes you can take very complex things, but the skill comes from being able to break that complexity down in a way that makes sense for everybody that needs to process, digest, and act on that experience. And he was able to do that really well. And for the rugby fans out there may not be many, but there may be some. The game plan was about a position versus possession based game. So when you stripped it right back, it was breaking the pitch into zones: the red zone, the amber zone, the green zone, and the gold zone. And essentially, you want to spend as much time in the gold zone as possible, because that's at the point where you score tries and score points, and as least amount of time in opposition territory in the red zone as possible. So the strategy became, how do you get out of the red zone, move through, and then really go for the jugular and have impact when you're in the gold zone? And so having a visual around that, and then being able to associate our performance behaviors to that, and do a piece of work around what's important for us as a team, what does this look like on the pitch, but equally, what does it look like off the pitch? I think that aligning kind of the dynamics of performance with the dynamics of team is really, really quite important.
And I think that's so powerful, because as leaders, we can have this great strategy, but if we can't translate it, as you say, to the point of performance, it loses its impact. And there's loads of nuggets in the book. But let's go back to the book then. So you were saying, Simon Middleton's strength was taking kind of complex things and simplifying them. And I think that's absolutely what you've done in this book. So you've built it on these, is it 4 building blocks?
Yeah, that's right.
Can you talk us through that?
Yeah, I can. There was lots of different pieces of work that underpin that. It was the experience of moving from individual into team sport, and then from working in team sport into supporting senior management teams, senior leadership teams, and then that oversight role of other psychologists working across the system. And what I really wanted to get to was a framework so that would have helped me that walked into that professional environment all those years ago, that didn't have that working framework to kind of plan my work against. So that essentially the book breaks down the building blocks of success, the things that I believe are absolutely non-negotiable in order to create environments that enable their people to achieve the highest possible levels of performance, but also in a way that's sustainable. So very simply, it's interrogating 4 pretty basic questions, which is around who are we? It's essentially about interrogating the answers to 4 questions, which essentially are: who are we? Why are we here? How do we play? And how do we win? And very simply, that's about people, purpose, method, and environment. So the fundamental thinking behind that is that I think quite often organizations don't necessarily spend enough time on a people level. So we have strategy, and we have methods of working, and we have processes, and we have things that we need to achieve, but we maybe spend a bit less time really understanding the people within our ranks and how they operate and how they work together. So the who part, the first building block, is all about who is in the room. Like, what are the absolute super strengths of our people? What are their areas of development? How do they show up under pressure? What predictions can we make about their behavior based upon their values and what we know about them? How can we utilize their strengths as a multiplier effect in the team? So it's really, it sounds simple, who are we? But essentially, it's about really interrogating the individuals and their unique strengths and how that can best support the team. And then the why we're here is all about purpose. We know individuals enjoy elevated experiences of well-being if they're connected to something that's higher than themselves. So that's all about ensuring that every single person within the team, within the organization, is aligned to that higher purpose. Everybody knows the thing that they're really going after, the North Star, the driver, and in some way, shape, or form, their day-to-day is connected to that purpose. So that's the second piece. The how we play is about method. It's a modus operandi. It's about how do we go about what we do here? What is our process? What are our structures? How do we plan, do, review? How do we set up our system in a way in which we are enhancing our opportunities of success? And then the final piece, how we win, is about, do we have the tools and environment to optimize the opportunity of success? Are we creating an environment here for our people that gives them the best opportunity to thrive? And that could look like mental skills training, but it can also look like creating an environment that is psychologically safe, that does dose, challenge, and support, that does stretch people, but does that in a way in which is conducive to sustainability. And the ethos behind all of those things, Nikki, is that people can do spectacular things when they're not in a good place. We know that people can be successful when they are struggling with their mental health or a variety of different reasons. But the question is how sustainable is that? And working at the very edge of your coping resources for a prolonged period of time has a cost. So this approach is all about layering up, is building on those building blocks. It's creating environments that, yes, really do push people and are challenging and do give people the opportunity to achieve the top levels of human endeavor, but in a way that's sustainable, that the cost isn't too great, and that they will be able to be successful over a period of time.
And that is, like, for me, that's what makes this book even more powerful. Not only is it that, like, this brilliant playbook that anybody that can read can take away practical things. I cannot tell you how many clients I've sat in coaching sessions with where we're talking about their teams. And I'm like, there's only so much we can cover in these coaching sessions. You need to read Kate's book, and then we'll pull out the bits that, like, we can work on in the coaching sessions, because it literally is a playbook of, like, here's the personality profiling that I use. Here's the conversations that I use. Here's some of the methodology. Like, there's so many practical bits in it. And it's wrapped around this humanness of, like, there's no point us having unbelievable performance if you're not thriving alongside it. And I think we've seen that with the Lionesses, not only as there's been, like, back-to-back success, but everybody that you see interviewed, there's just so much joy and happiness to be part of that team. It doesn't feel like it is, like, it's come at, like, a negative cost. And I'm sure there's been huge sacrifices to get to that place, but people seem to have joy. And I'm like, that's performance, isn't it?
It's such a great word, that, isn't it? Joy. But it makes me smile to hear you say that. That so many times you come off the back of a major tournament. And as I said, I've been so lucky. I've had the opportunity I was out in Tokyo at the Olympic Games. I've been at World Championships. I've been at, sat in Twickenham Stadium watching Harlequins in the Premiership final. Like, I've had the opportunity to be in some unbelievable environments and experience some unbelievable things. And you always get asked at the end of it, oh, how was it? It's so difficult to describe. It's so difficult to describe that experience. And that's something that we may get to around how do you decompress from things like that. But that was my answer around the kind of Euros this year. Like, how was it? I just experienced absolute joy. It was an absolute joy to be part of that, to work alongside those staff and to work alongside those players. It felt joyful. And ultimately, how amazing is that, to be able to come away from something which could be perceived as, incredibly high pressure, and your overriding emotion of that is one of joy.
So if we start with this first piece around people, what might be some of the key things that you can share that are in the book around, you talk there about super strengths and knowing people's super strengths, but in the book you also talk about boat sinker behaviours. Can you share a little bit about how do you approach that with a team?
Yeah, I think the first thing that I will say at this point, and I'm sometimes unpopular for saying this, but I think any business or organisation that you walk into has values, which are quite often nice posters on a wall that look very pretty, and they depict different things, like the climb up the mountain or various different elements. And one of the things that I've learned through my career is that it can sometimes be incredibly futile to take a group of disparate personalities that have very different value systems, that have got different genetics, have grown up in different environments, have got different experiences, and the result of that have very different value systems, and try to align them and make them be the same. So that one of the big pieces around this, who are we, is really getting into people's individual values, because I think at an individual level, that is incredibly important. Like, what you value is going to be very different to me, but that will drive your behavior. That will cause you to react in a certain way to certain situations that I may or may not react to. So I think having an understanding of people's value systems and their context is incredibly important on an individual level, less so in a team. So the first thing that I'd be looking to is just who is this person? What are they all about? What are some of their experiences? What does that mean for them? And people often question that. And do we really need to know each other inside out? And how important is that in a performance context? And my response to that is relatively simple. I don't think you can hold people to account under pressure if you don't have a connection with that individual. Now, that connection can vary at levels of depth, but the only way that you can really hold the mirror up and hold people to account in a way in which that will be accepted and contribute to performance gains is if there is some element of connection. So I do think that work is incredibly important. So when we're the first step that we usually take with the team is around that, is that what do we know about each other, and what are some of the examples that we can share. And then that leads into this idea around, and and what are people's strengths, what are people's super strengths, what are people's strengths, what are their areas of acceptable weakness, and what are their boat sinkers, as you've referred to. And essentially that's positive psychology. It's taking a positive psychology approach. And that's sometimes where sports psychology or performance psychology can differ from other areas of psychology. Psychology traditionally has been to help people that are struggling reach a level of effective functioning. Whereas what we tend to do as sports psychologists is we quite often work with people that are functioning perfectly well, in fact, are thriving and doing brilliantly, but helping them find additional percentages to elevate their performance. So positive psychology lends itself to that incredibly well. And one of the pieces of work that we quite often do is actually looking at a strengths-based approach of how can we absolutely maximize the things that people are brilliant at, because sometimes that gives you better bang for your buck than spending a huge amount of time trying to pull up the areas that aren't so great. And that's where those definitions come from. So super strengths is what's the thing that you have the capability of being the best in the world at? What's your real competitive edge? All said and done, what's the reason why you're picked? What's the reason why you're in this job? Why have you been selected into SLT? What's the thing that stands you apart? And then the strengths is about the different areas, things that you're good at. The areas of acceptable weakness are that you can't be good at everything. And actually, we can waste a lot of time trying to improve things that, yeah, they're not quite where they could be, but they're not sinking the boat. They're not getting in the way of performance. That's different then to the boat sinkers. Like, what is the stuff that's absolutely getting in the way of the performance that unless we put a plan in place around that, it's going to sink the boat? So we kind of spend our time focusing on super strengths and eradicating boat sinkers, and maybe less time on all the different elements that, yeah, they're not areas of strength, but they're acceptable weaknesses and they're not sinking the boat.
And I would encourage people, when they get the book and read it, you share some of the methodologies that you absolutely do to, as you said, talk about how do you get to know somebody. There's the great timeline that you share in there. And so there's, you share the actual detail, which I think is brilliant because you properly like pulled back the curtains and gone, this is what I do, which I think is really powerful because a lot of teams know, it'd be great to know what your zone of genius is and all of that. But you're like, how do you do that? And you share the how as well as the why and what we're doing this for.
The thing is as well, every team is different, isn't it? And so having some ideas, like that's my biggest hope for the book actually, is that it just sparks creative conversations and people wanting to go and explore and be curious about this space, because what works in one team maybe won't work in another. But if you know what you're going after, then it's part of the fun is to think of different creative ways of how you might get to that end goal.
Yeah. And just not underestimating the power of this. I do a women's leadership retreat with actually somebody that's background is in UK sports, and he introduced the timeline on this retreat, and it is so powerful to do. Like often people are in tears, and we talk about connection and psychological safety, getting to that place where you can talk about the highs and lows in your life. And then I was just thinking about a conversation I had last week. I was coaching a new client, met with her and her line manager, who's the sponsor of the coaching. And her line manager just reflected back to her super strength. And her super strength was that she cared as deeply about their customers as the line manager. And they both started crying because she was like, I know that I can totally trust you. And what we were talking about in that coaching was some of her potential boat sinkers as well. But because she shared like, this is your super strength, and I just so appreciate that about you. Again, that level of trust of like, I've got your back because I really respect you for your super strengths, but we've got to deal with some of these boat sinkers. And again, it's like, this is so powerful because it was like, okay, that's not criticism. It's a reality. It's holding up the mirror, but doing it in that powerful way.
And it's the conversations that we don't have, isn't it? Like that's we did a similar example with the Lionesses in when I started in England, we were 9 months out from the home Euros. And one of the first activities we did as a team was that timeline exercise, which essentially is taking a piece of paper, drawing a horizontal line down the middle, and then just plotting out some of life experiences from birth to the present day. So the good stuff above the line, the difficult or the more challenging things below the line, and encouraging individuals to share that story. The caveat to that is, and I think it's important in any kind of session like this, is that people have to be comfortable with what they share. So everybody owns the safety of that exercise. People only will share the things that they are willing to, and only ever really on a kind of one-to-one level. The purpose isn't then to come back in a group and share the ins and outs, but more to share the experience. And that day was no exception. So the players and some of the staff had gone off in pairs. They'd started to share a little bit of their history and some of the things they've experienced. And when we brought the group back, we just gave them the option. Do you want to share anything about how you found that last hour or so, and anything that stuck out to you? And I still remember one of the individuals saying, I've spent the last 10 years on camp with the person that I was partnered with, and nothing they told me today I knew. And it's so powerful. And some of the staff were like, a staff member a few weeks ago referred back to that session again, because the person that they'd spent time with on that afternoon, they still feel like they've got a connection with them. And we work with multiple different personalities. We work in environments with very varied individuals and different collections of personalities. And we're not always going to get on with everybody. We're not always going to like the people that we work and strive alongside, but having some understanding of them and what impact that has on who they are and how they interact is really, really important. Like we make assumptions as human beings. We make lots and lots of assumptions, don't we? We assume that because somebody's behaved in a certain way, we attach meaning to that. But what this kind of work does is it gives you context. So it doesn't necessarily put you in a position where you say, well, I completely agree with that now. I understand that they do that and I agree with it. You may not agree with it, but you will at least have a context and an understanding behind the behavior. And that's the thing that enables people to work effectively together, I think.
Yeah, and it's just reminded me of relationship therapy, where they talk about when you've got connection, you can manage conflict really healthily.
Yeah, carefrontation, someone said the other day. What a great way of describing that. I can't remember who it was. I was in a conversation with someone recently and they described it as carefrontation, is being able to connect with honesty and hold to an account, which actually is a form of care.
Yeah, and that's where the growth happens, isn't it? We can hold that space.
Yeah.
So there's so much more we could talk about around people, but I'm conscious we've got to go to the other building blocks as well. So you then talked about purpose. And I think, again, in the book, it's so powerful because purpose is often bandied around in the corporate space, and it's a bit like values, like we put it on the wall. But I know that obviously from sports, we know so much around athletes that might have had a purpose to win gold. They get their gold and then they go into like this deep depression afterwards because they're like, oh, was that it? And I think the work you do is to take it to like beyond that. Can you speak a bit about how you work with purpose?
Yeah, and I think the example that you've given there is a really good one. And we certainly have experienced this working in Olympic sport. And it's been termed at times the Olympic blues. And it's exactly that, is that individuals have been working so hard to achieve an aim, and then they have their moment and they achieve that. And anecdotally, quite often, the athletes that struggle in the aftermath of the Olympic Games are sometimes the most successful ones, is the ones that have actually gone and achieved that goal. Because then what does it mean? And there's many athletes that have spoken really eloquently around that, is that you chase this dream and then you achieve the dream, and where does that leave you? And this is kind of the thing around the purpose, is that in an ideal world, your purpose shouldn't necessarily be outcome related. Is that what's the driver behind that? Because an outcome and a success and an achievement gives you a platform to be able to do a multitude of other things. And again, there's a great example from the Lionesses around that, like the team on the bus to Trafalgar Square after that Euros win in 2022 started to shape their letter to government around equal access for women in schools. And that was it's a really strong driver amongst the team around how they can utilize their platform for societal impact and for greater good. And of course, competing in the Euros, winning a tournament, it elevates your platform, but it gave them then the opportunity to do something phenomenal. And I think that that's essentially what we mean with the high purpose. It's what's the thing that stands the test of time, that isn't dependent upon an Olympic gold medal or a tournament win? What's the thing that in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, still remains true because it's integral to who you are as a person or an organization or a business? And I think that's a litmus test of a North Star, is does it stand the test of time? And it can be related to achievement, of course it can, but in an ideal world, it's separate from results. And there's a really good example of this. I was contacted by Cambridge Women Rowing Club in 2014. And the women, there's a race that takes place on the River Thames, the Tideway, every single year between Oxford and Cambridge. And most people are familiar with it. It's a huge sporting event. It's watched by hundreds of thousands of people live and millions on TV. But what people are less familiar with, unless you really follow the boat race, is that the women were never allowed to race the boat race on the Tideway on the Thames. The women raced on a different stretch of water a few days earlier. So when we talk about the boat race, we're really referring to the men's Oxford Cambridge boat race. And then the boat race got some sponsorship through an investment bank. And the condition of the sponsorship was equality, is that they wanted those women to have the same opportunity to be able to race the Tideway, to have the media interest, the same opportunities as their male counterparts, the same training facilities, the same support, etc. And I mean, when this project got relayed to me, I was all in. That's the sort of thing where I'm like, okay, how can you not get involved in something like that? But that group of women, that crew, they were just phenomenal women. They had such high standards of work, such huge work ethic, but such humility. They were an absolute joy to work with. And it was a huge piece of work that we did with that group that year. Oxford had a Olympic medalist in their crew. And the Cambridge crew, they had some phenomenally talented athletes in there, but they weren't matched on the experience of what they were coming up against. So our journey that year was all about, how do we make sure on race day, when the helicopter's flying above and there's all these thousands of people, and that's an experience that they're not used to, how do we make sure that we provide the best opportunity for them to be able to do what they're capable of on that day? And the chips will fall as they may in terms of results. So we spent a lot of time working with that group around, well, why? I mean, they're getting up before the crack of dawn. They're going out in the freezing cold. They're training, then they're going to university. They're studying all day. They're training again in the evening. They're then catching up on their work. They're finishing at midnight and they're all doing it again. And I was really curious, what's driving that? Like, what is important to you? And where we got to with the crew that year was, it's all about challenging the status quo. It was all about leaving a legacy. It was all about standing on the shoulders of those that have come before and those that will come after to drive change. And so then, of course, you want to win. Anybody that works in performance, anyone that works in business, you want to be the best. You want to win. You want to generate more sales. You want to make the most money. You want to get the gold medal, whatever that looks like. But what else?
Yeah.
Like, if you achieve that, then what else? What else do you gain from that? And if you don't, then what else do you get? What do you gain? Because otherwise it can be a futile process at times, can't it? So that, of course, those girls were disappointed that they didn't win the boat race that year, but they had achieved their North Star. That still all remained true. They challenged the status quo. They left legacy. They went down in history as the first women to ever row the Tideway. And so it's what is it that connects us that's far greater than what we're going to do on that day?
Oh, I think that's such a great example. And it reminds me of Adam Peaty in the swimming this summer. And he got silver when he was kind of meant to get gold. But he was genuinely like, and he talked about like how much he struggled with addiction and mental health. But he seemed to be like, I'm totally at peace with this because my purpose was bigger than that gold.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember our mutual friend, Katie Warren or Katie Mobed, talking about being in the Olympic Village, and she walked past and saw him sitting on a bench, just like taking in the atmosphere and taking in the moment. And she was like, that's success. Like, he totally looked at peace and so present and not.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I'm like, oh, that's the goal, isn't it? That's that sustainable success that you talk about.
Yeah. And Tom Daly talks about that around finding perspective. And he put it really beautifully around, it took him a long time to realize that he's not the main character. He's only the main character in his own story. And actually, we spend so much time, don't we, worrying about how we're being perceived, what other people think, managing our own expectations, the expectations of others, feeling that we need to do all these different things. And then at some point, ideally, people get to that turning point in their life where they actually get some perspective.
And hopefully, and the work that you do is, it's not hitting a brick wall. It's not like having that breakdown to get the perspective. So I'm conscious of time and we've got another 2 blocks to cover. So can you talk us through the next 2?
Yeah, the how we play is essentially about method. It's essentially about having absolute clarity. And it really, I suppose it's plan, do, review. Like goal setting is the easiest thing in the world to do, but it's one of the most difficult to do well. And it's really interrogating performance. It's being absolutely crystal clear on what success looks like, what the key performance indicators are, whether we are performing in relation to those, and if not, why. And I think it's taking a huge concerted effort to interrogate the underpinning reasons for performance or underperformance. Because quite often that happens in sport is when you start to review performances, you can review it cognitively and in relation to what happened. Well, we should have done this, but we did that, or that didn't work. But if we remain true to the point at the start of this call was everybody has to be crystal clear on the game plan. Well, if we're clear on the game plan, but we didn't do it, then why is that? Well, it's either because the game plan wasn't quite right, or it's because we didn't execute it. Well, if we didn't execute that, then why is that? And essentially, the how we play, the method piece is all about really understanding what are the factors that relate to success and what are some of the things that derail or get in the way. And sports psychology as a discipline is about that. It's about over time recreating the good, eliminating the bad, having a thorough understanding of the factors that underpin success and creating opportunities as much as possible to ensure that they're in play whilst eradicating the things that aren't working. And there are lots of examples that I can give for you, but we're going to completely derail and just go off in a million different directions. But essentially, it's like, what is your method and your process for performing? But also, what is the day to day, the week to week, the month to month? What does that look like? What's the method of the system? How is that set up? Is it set up in a way in which people are still able to be creative? People are able to analyze, and it's matching the personalities of the people that are involved. So there's a big piece to that. But the crux of it is does our method align to what we're going after to achieve under pressure? And are we planning? Are we reviewing? Are we executing in the right way?
And I think the thing I took from that really relates back to kind of the work I do with my clients is, are we having the kind of conversations that we really need to have? Like you talked about holding up the mirror and being, let's have the honest conversation we really need to have here. Let's not skim over it.
No. And it always surprises me. And I guess this goes back to the strength-based versus deficit-based approaches. There's so many of my friends work in a whole range of different contexts. And when I talk to them about like performance reviews, they're always interested in what happens in sport. And then they'll say, well, yeah, we have a PDR like every 6 months, or like it blows my mind. And I think that's that. And of course, all contexts are different. People do this in different ways. But in sport, you're so entrenched and so used to interrogating everything, every single training session, every single day. What worked? Why? What do we learn from that? How does that inform what we do tomorrow? What didn't? Why not? What's the thing that we need to change? How might that look? Well, let's go again tomorrow. And it seems quite alien to me that someone would sit down at a 6 month point and review the previous 6 months in terms of how that's gone. Like it's a constant process and it's exciting. It's fun. It's fun to engage in that kind of work regularly.
And I always kind of have to say to my corporate clients, like you spend like 100% perform, whereas in elite sports, you get 80% like practice and 20% perform. So there is more capacity to do that stuff. And that's why it's like, what can we borrow and how can we do more of that?
Do you know, that's the question I get most often when I do work in corporate settings. It's like, well, we're very different to sport. You get 4 years to prepare for an event and then you have to execute. And then, or you're working in professional sport and it's week in, week out, or you're working in an international window. But actually, I don't think it's as different as people think. I think that's probably my learn. Like, of course, in business and in corporate context, you're having to perform all the time. You're performing. But you are in a sporting context too. It's just a different level of performance. You have to show up every single training session. You have to perform every single day because there's always that underlying voice around how that it's those day to day that leads to selection that then leads to the increase in pressure. So it's different and similar, but I would argue it's more similar than people think. I think we live in a day to day performance world, and I do think you can interrogate performance as you're performing.
Yeah.
And actually having mechanisms and strategies for how to do that is really useful. I think I do talk about that in the book in terms of performing in action. Well, what does that look like? And how do you prime and how do you make sense of stuff as it's going on?
Yeah. And there, again, so many practical tools in there.
The ebb and flow that you don't get so much, I guess, in business is around like off season. There's no such thing as an off season, is it? If you're working in banking or in some of those other sectors, then what does that look like? And then I think that that's about, okay, well, how do you microdose that then? How do you microdose rest and recovery? How do you ensure people are able to continue to perform at that level without getting set periods where you know that now you can pull off the brake, you can put on the brakes a little bit?
So finally, the environment piece, and I think we might have to get you back for like round 2 to get into some of the real specifics, because there's so much just in the environment piece, like from like psychology on the grass to stadium skills and all of that. So, and you also talk about don't ice a collapsing cake. Like there's so many nuggets in this part of the book. So talk me like at a high level what this is about.
I love that analogy of don't ice a collapsing cake, which essentially what that means is I think sometimes we spend time thinking about strategies to cope. Like in so many different environments, in so many different contexts, we're operating right on the edge of our coping resources. Sport's no exception to that, and neither's business. And in fact, it's not just business in the sense of the word that most people go to, teachers, that there's any kind of context. People are working long hours, high pressure, where there are consequences for results. And this idea of we can learn breathing techniques, for example. There's visualization. There's lots of different strategies that we can utilize, and yes, they are all can be incredibly powerful. But it's almost the icing on the top of a cake. That if that cake isn't solid, if the foundation isn't there, then those strategies will only get you so far. So the idea about this last section is that what does that foundation look like? Are we putting strategies on top of a solid foundation? And is that going to stand us in good stead to be able to sustain performance over time? And I always find it quite interesting. Quite often with teams, I've asked them to kind of reflect on their well-being and their self-care. And well-being essentially is an umbrella term for different facets: physical health, psychological health, spiritual health, financial health, social health, educational. There's different component parts that make up well-being. But when you ask people to reflect on their self-care strategies and what they spend their time engaging in, you'll always find that they prioritize some areas over others, where actually we sometimes achieve the greatest levels of well-being by being more deliberate and balanced in how we look after ourselves and our self-care. So that foundation piece is just around, it is how are people managing themselves in the context in which they live and work. You would have heard this a million times, the whole bucket analogy. Like everyone's got a stress bucket, and you fill that bucket up to the point that it overspills. Well, then it makes an incredible mess, and it's a huge amount of work to clean it up. Far better that you make some holes in it and you let some of that water out over time, so that it never gets to the point of burst. And the reality of the situation is every individual, their starting capacity is different. Some people have far greater capacity than others. Their bucket's bigger. Some it feels quicker. But what we do know is everybody needs to have mechanisms by which they keep some element of balance, because as we said earlier, the cost of not doing so is just incredibly high.
And there is so much in there, isn't there? So my final question to you is then, because you're a busy working mum, am I right in saying you've got 3 children?
Yeah, I've got 3 kids, yeah.
So what do you do? What practically are some of the things that you do around that? Because you're working in a demanding environment, I'm imagining, and you live a very busy life. So what does that practically look like for you?
To be honest with you, I've had to learn some hard lessons, and I don't think I've always got it right. It's challenging. But one of the things, and this is really simple, but the thing that's made the biggest difference for me over these last few years is just asking myself a really simple question. Like I've worked through my why with Katie, actually, our shared friend. And I found that process brilliant. And I'm a big believer in that. There's everything that I would support others to do. I will go through that process myself. And my values I have strong values around family and my priorities. And if anybody ever says to me, what's the most important thing to you, is, of course, it's my family, it's my husband, it's my kids. But then the question that I always follow that up to myself is, and how have you prioritized your time this week? Of the things that are most important to you, how much time have you prioritized there in comparison? And what I've been guilty of many, many times is that the things that are most important to me are not the things that are sometimes prioritized the most in terms of my time and how my working week unfolds. And I think as I've got older, as I've probably got more confident, as I've got more used to working in this space, I'm better able these days to prioritize time when it matters. And again, just honest conversations at home. Like, I have a busy mind and I like solving things and making sense of stuff and working it through. And working at home sometimes now, as a lot of us do, going from that environment downstairs and back into family again, I'm in the room, but I'm not there. I'm still processing. I'm still trying to make sense of what's happened. So one of the really simple things for me is just there has to be some sense making time in a day. And for me, like going out on a walk or getting on my bike or doing something, yes, it's activity, but actually the bigger driver for me is sense making. I need quiet. I need to figure things out in my head. And I found that moving enables me to do that. So giving myself that space, giving myself time to make sense of stuff means that I can be present in the family more. And the reality of it is the world keeps turning, right? Things don't, there's no disaster that happens. Spending more time as a mum and more time with the kids, it isn't creating issues elsewhere. And I think sometimes we need to learn that. We need to experience that, is that we take so much responsibility. And I definitely have a tendency to do that, to take responsibility for things that I'm not always responsible for. And actually letting go of that sometimes is the biggest growth area and development that we can achieve. It gives, and I think you learn that as a leader as well, being in management positions. What I've learned over time is actually you need brilliant people in the right place, and you need to give them permission to go. And actually, like I've at times probably struggled with that control component of wanting to be in control of everything. I've had to learn how to let those things go. Essentially, people are more successful when you work collaboratively together and you give people opportunity to fly.
And that's such a beautifully honest response, because it's like, it's not all tied up in a neat bow because you're a performance psychologist and yeah, I've got this stuff nailed. Like, we're all working through it. We're all work in progress. I'm going to put you on the spot here and say, I would love to invite you back for part 2, because I think there is so much we could dive into around this psychology on the pitch. I also want to ask you about kind of women's psychology specifically, because obviously you are head of women's psychology, but I know we've run out of time for today. So I'm hoping we can get you back for part 2 and continue.
Well, if you're willing to have me again, I would be more than happy to come back for part 2. Of course I would. It's been a real pleasure to speak to you.
Thank you, Kate. And it goes without saying, I would recommend every single person listening gets your book, How to Win, Lessons in Success from the Front Line of Performance Psychology by Dr. Kate Hayes. It is genuinely, huge kudos to you writing this on top of a full-time job with 3 kids. But like, it is phenomenal. So thank you for sharing it with us.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Nikki. Thanks for having me.
If you've enjoyed this episode of Wisdom for Working Mums, I'd love for you to share it on social media or with the amazing women in your life. I'd also love to connect with you, so head over to luminate-group.co.uk where you'll find ways to stay in touch. And if this episode resonated with you, one of the best ways to support the show is by subscribing and leaving a review on iTunes. Your review helps other women discover this resource, so together we can lift each other up as we rise. So thanks for listening. Until next time, take care.